Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's Brian, Miss Berlin, and Mr. Betcher for bringing down security.
Yay.
Hello.
Oh, God.
I'm excited. I guess Brian's
awkward
not.
silence already. Oh, no.
I'll fix that in post. Oh, it's so much silence. So much silence.
I thought you didn't edit. You just uploaded it.
I do mostly.
Banter is fun. Keep it.
That's right.
Yeah,
we're at
definitely.
full power this week, though. I mean, Mr. Betcher's here, Ms. Berlin's here. Nobody's out camping or doing extracurriculars with family. It's all good.
Dude, I'm home until, I have a couple short trips, but I don't have any flights yet until January.
I thought you said end of October.
I'm very happy that I'm going to be home for the next almost 3 months.
That's cool. Mr. Betcher, how's the fam going?
Great.
Okay.
Everything's going good. Kids are doing well in college.
Wait, what?
So,
That's right.
fine.
I forgot. Yeah. Money bags. He told me a story. He invested in some property near the University of Texas at Austin campus so that his children could be safer when they go to college. And I was like, wow, Login B must be pulling in some fat cash, because be able to...
No, we've been saving for 10, 12 years.
Whew, goodness.
We executed the plan, so
Nice.
that's
Perfect.
Fantastic. All right.
That's why I'm sending my children to military.
Oh. Well,
Or Canada.
Canada. So for those of you who are like, who's that fourth person talking? That's our guest this week. Lee Holmes is here. Ms. Berlin, she saw him at DerbyCon and he had expressed interest in coming. I'll let Ms. Berlin finish the rest of the story.
I don't think he expressed interest in coming. I was just begging him to come on the show.
Please.
he felt sorry for him.
I was starstruck.
I think it's probably in reverse.
When you met Brian, right?
No, when you met Lee, you were like, "Oh my God, it's Lee Holmes!"
And I was wasted. It was 3 a.m.
Oh my goodness!
LobbyCon is the best. That's what makes DerbyCon.
Oh
Yep.
yeah.
I do remember a story. Mick Douglas has been on a few times here, and he said he was teaching a Powershell class at DerbyCon, and who should walk into his class but Lee Holmes? And he's like, "Oh my God, I had to step up my game so much because Lee Holmes is in there." And he said it was very positive. It was very, very worthwhile experience. But it was like you were giving clarifying, you were making some clarifications on some things that he didn't know about himself. And he said it was very, very fun experience. So that was my first experience of knowing about Mr. Holmes here. So, yeah. So Amanda, go ahead.
How was your DerbyCon, Lee?
It was amazing. Just the amount of just good vibes that you get from everywhere. It's, having been to DEF CON and Black Hat and stuff like that, I think some people can get this impression of what the security community is like. And then you come to a place like Derby where I just freaking don't know how it's happened, but it's just got such a positive vibe there. And, it's a con that was identified as people just stepping out and doing amazing things for each other and sitting down and, you just walk around and talk to anybody and just get to see what they've got to share. It's just such a good vibe there. It's every night went late just because there's so much good stuff and fun people to talk to. It's so amazing. It took me just days to get off that, kind of get back down to reality after coming home.
Yeah.
I went to
credit to Dave. I mean, he really built that culture, and I think it was, I don't know how he did it, but that was a real good experience for me. And I think he really instilled that in everyone just for his positive attitude and the way he treated everyone. And then it kind of spread from there like a disease, right?
It's amazing the impact that culture has from, a core set of people. In any organization, if you have a clear way that you have a culture that you want to make happen throughout the organization, it takes just literally a couple people really, really focusing on demonstrating those values, encouraging others to have those values, and it's just incredible the impact that any of us can have in any organization, whether it's a con, whether it's at work, just living those kind of positive values. It's incredible.
I think it's a trickle down effect too. It happens, you know, if you can get somebody at the top that can show those values, it tends to repeat.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, you know, countless times at Derby had the conversation with people who are like, oh, it's really sad it's ending. And one of the things that made it so special was it's not just that you were interacting with, you know, 6 or 10 people as part of the DerbyCon planning committee that were just really nice and genuine. It was just literally anybody that you talk to. Mm-hmm. And to know that you can just take that same aspect of what you liked and take it to other cons, and it doesn't have to be over in spirit.
And you got a black badge too, so now I'll get to see you at all the other conferences.
How many conferences are taking up the black badge now?
There's like 7 or 8 now, I think.
Nice. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool.
That was such a great example of the community coming together and realizing that not only are the black badges going to be honored at one place, but to have all of these conferences coming together and say, we feel like we're spiritually the same conference, you know, really focused on not just the kind of edgy attack stuff, but also realistic stuff when it comes to defense. The family values, the values of being welcoming to new people, and to have now, like 8 or a dozen conferences coming out and saying, this is a culture that we want to have in our conference, and saying that we're going to have reciprocity on black badges is just so cool.
Yeah. It's not something I don't think I would have thought of, but whoever did, that's a great idea.
Yep.
Yeah, the Derby community is going to be a good thing to start up. Very much like a B-Sides, I would imagine, where if you want to be part of the DerbyCom community or Derby community, then you'll need to follow certain guidelines like the B-Side stuff. So it's I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with that in the future. So,
and I think it's too a thing it's not intended to be a separate thing than B-Sides. It's intended to be, I think, more like, not to use it in a disparaging term, of course, but more like a certification where like you have an event and it's part of the DerbyCon family, and it might be a B-Sides, it might be something big, where you've got family values, you believe in helping others, you believe in philanthropy, those kind of things.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. And, there's a lot of organizations out there like that. I'm going to see what it takes to join that too for my own conference that we're running. Matt Domko and myself and Wendy Knox Everett, the InfoSec camp out. So we're going to see what it takes to be as part of the DerbyCom community and see what we can, see what we can do to help spread that out here in the West Coast as well. So. All right. So for those of the people listening who may not know who Lee Holmes is, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for a living, and how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lee Holmes. I'm the lead security architect of Azure Storage, Media, and Edge. And so we're the part of Azure that does, of course, Azure Storage. And then we also have Azure Media Services, and then a bunch of Cloud Edge technologies, for example, Azure Stack and Databox Edge, kind of products that are really working at bringing bunches of the benefits of the cloud onto on-premises. Nice. And that's what I do for the last couple of years. Before that, I was doing some central security work for a group, and that came by way of starting in the PowerShell team in around 2004. I worked on PowerShell for probably 10 years, doing feature development as well as security. And then over time, the security expertise, I started helping out teams that were in addition to just the PowerShell team. That's kind of one of the amazing things about being part of a larger company like Microsoft, is when you do have passion, interest, and skill in security, there's just so much opportunity where teams are really excited about getting the chance to leverage your knowledge or expertise to help them out as well. Cool. And so after PowerShell started really helping out teams, like for example, Azure Automation and Azure Backup and Azure Stack was born out of that organization. So it's just amazing to me to have a company the size of Microsoft that, we talked so much about culture already, but to have such a strong culture that security is number one. When I've heard, we'll be in these big executive reviews, and when there was a time last month where somebody says, I thought what I heard you say was you're prioritizing a feature over security. And you could hear like just the gas go out of the room. Everybody's like, absolutely, that would never be a decision you would make. It's always security first. And if anyone's ever coming across in a way that's not clearly that, they're going to get a very big talking to. So it's just wonderful to be part of a company that cares about it so deeply.
Cool. All right. So your talk at DerbyCon was about PowerShell security, looking back from the inside.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ms. Berlin.
I was going to say, I like how you covered where you first started at Microsoft, because you were part of the Encarta team.
Encarta.
Yeah.
It was amazing. Wow. So I started.
I know. I was amazed.
So I had to ride a horse to work.
And right. I don't think I owned
candles on the walls. Yeah. Wow. But it was amazing because when we started at Encarta, that was, when I started at Microsoft in 2002, and so starting at Encarta, I was being part of doing all the website stuff. So I did some stuff with the folks who were doing the CD product, or at that point DVD, but I was doing a lot of the stuff with the web version. And realistically, in 2002, Wikipedia was becoming a pretty major thing, but it wasn't the thing. Today anyone talks about where do you go to get information injected into your brain, and that's Wikipedia. And so it's just starting to come up, and that was before there was any social media. That was before there was just really any communities out there. And so when we wanted to know what people thought about a feature in Encarta, for example, we basically you'd have to run a usability study, and you'd get like 4 or 5 people coming in, and they would do their pre-canned tasks. You'd have our usability researchers watch them and see if they're getting confused. But that was all very sort of prescriptive and just kind of going down a script. But let's say a month and a half ago, some people like Scott Hanselman on Twitter was like, can I just take a moment to thank Encarta from, the early 2000s? And this thread blew up, and someone, Missy from Microsoft, also started tweeting some things about it, and it was the first time I forwarded some people these threads because they had hundreds of comments, and there were still a bunch of people from Encarta at Microsoft, and started forwarding this thread around, and it was literally the first time that most of them had ever heard any direct feedback on the parts of the product that impacted people. Hearing somebody say, I used to spend hours in Mind Maze and things like that. people just never had heard that actual, like, just that visceral reaction of how you impacted somebody. It was so cool to be able to revisit that 15 years later.
Yeah, that's super. Because I wasn't even sure Encarta was still a thing, so I googled it, and the first link that comes up is the Wikipedia link to Encarta.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a bit of recursion there. Yeah.
Well, funny. Speaking of recursion, one of the things that I knew was going to be dangerous was Wikipedia had Encarta, the editorial oversight into articles was incredible. You had professional researchers, professional editors reviewing every single article. You could be sure that it was something worth citing. To the point where the article on fractals was written by Benoit Mandelbrot, like the guy who literally invented them.
Wow, that's pretty nice.
And it was like one of those things where it wasn't even as long as any of his papers. It was probably 5 or 10 paragraphs. And it's like, you just literally cannot argue provenance. That's like the most authoritative article you'll ever have on fractals. But realistically, if you want to know about what they are and what they do, you're going to go to a lower quality resource than that. And that's kind of when I started to see some danger that some of these things with even less provenance are going to just satisfy the need for information a little bit better. But yeah, reading that article was like, reading from the mind of a master directly.
Very cool. I found that. I posted that in our show notes if people want to read the Hanselman Twitter thread about Encarta. So it's August 6th. So all right. So Miss Berlin, let's talk about why you wanted to have Mr. Holmes on.
So first I was, what was I tweeting about? I was bitching about logging, PowerShell command line stuff. And, you replied with a better event ID that I could use in the stuff that I was writing, right?
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah. So that's like originally why I wanted you on, because I was focusing really heavily on, creating meaningful alerts in the sim that I work in.
Yeah.
And I've not come up with that many. So I'm like, well, probably good to have you on. And the first one I started with was execution policies. So before I actually create an alert on anything, I dive into like, should I be, like, just because it's on a list that other people have, defensive alerts on, like, should I actually have an alert on this? Like, is it meaningful at all? And that's when I found out that I was lied to all along, that execution policies weren't created as a security precaution. But you talked a little bit in your talk too about how it was kind of just like chmod for Linux.
Yeah.
Right. So you can kind of just not shoot yourself in the foot as a PowerShell admin. Right?
Yeah.
But people, I've heard people bitching that there's this terrible security measure, and there's so many ways that you can get around it.
Yeah.
Well, right, those were coded in there on purpose.
Well, especially the thing that I don't get is how people can have that mindset. Oh, look at how easy it is to bypass, when we literally wrote a switch for PowerShell called execution policy bypass. Like,
right.
you're not an Uber hacker if you're using a parameter that we wrote.
Correct.
Right.
And actually, that was so in PowerShell version 1 that was released in 2006. What we realized is we wanted to have this execution policy that was basically like a souped up chmod. And we made the one mistake there that we only let you configure it as a system-wide policy. And it was really just because we didn't want to get into this whole group policies and command line switches and whatever. We just made it a switch that you could only change in HKey local machine. And it was just really out of convenience. And then admins started saying, well, since this is in HKey local machine, that means that standard users can't break out of it. So that means it's a security control. And we're like, oh no, don't do that, because all you got to do is paste things into the window, or all you have to use is PowerShell -command or something like that. And so we went so like intentionally the other way. So we made sure we put things in the HK current user hive. We made sure we wrote a new switch called execution policy bypass. We made it an environment variable. We put out a blog post that says, this is not a security control. This isn't your next gen APT blocker. And I think it's done an okay job of kind of changing that perception. But yeah, it was one of those things where we were really disappointed how mistaken people were by an implementation detail.
Yeah, and I was told that for years, that it was just something that, PowerShell is evil and we need to uninstall. When it first came out, we need to uninstall it off of all the Windows workstations. And, it's this super powerful tool that, anybody can, destroy your environment in.
Well, at the time you were being told to remove that, like PowerShell Empire was the new hotness, wasn't it? Or is this
I don't
before
know.
that?
This was like 10 years ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
maybe like Windows before, like Windows Vista, right?
Yeah.
Windows Vista was the first one that it came standard on, or no?
It was part of Windows 7. Was the first
Windows 7.
when it was, yeah.
Okay.
So around about that time, yeah, because it was 2008 R2, so that was around 2009 or 10. So it was around 2008 when it first started becoming part of the OS.
But it was an add-on. It was an add-on to XP, and before that, you could download it and install it.
Originally, it was released as a standalone download, so it was an MSI that you could download and just have it installed. It also came part of the Windows SDK for a little while, but once it started getting out there, it made it into Windows eventually. There's for some of the history, thinking back of how challenging it was to actually get it into Windows. There was at the same time that PowerShell was coming into maturity in terms of version 1. It's written in C#, .NET, and just before Vista, there was the whole like Longhorn OS that was going to be totally built on everything managed code, and people kind of like hit the managed code bottle a bit too hard. And we're also in this place of just trying to really overplan a release. And so there was this massive reset. Everybody calls it the Longhorn reset, where basically managed code, so C# and things like that, got painted with this brush of being at fault for everything that had happened with that reset. And so there was this cultural war against managed code. And Jeffrey Snover does an amazing job of talking through. He did a presentation of, I think it was like the cultural battle to bring PowerShell to life. Something like that. You'll have to use some smarter Googling, or I will have to. But it's a great thing to just hear through some of that history. It's just Jeffrey Snover is an amazing person at understanding like really what makes two people disagree and working through those disagreements and stuff. And if without his just miraculous talent in that degree, in that perspective, I don't think PowerShell ever would have shipped.
Cool. Yeah, we have that link in the show notes. I just found it. So,
how close was it to what I remembered? What's
the cultural battle to remove Windows from Windows Server?
Oh, I was close.
I believe that's it.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Cool. Yep. So, yeah, that link's in the show notes as well. So, all right. So
you mentioned installing it and making it a part of Windows. And I had a lot of clients that said, well, we don't have to upgrade. We tell them, you got to upgrade to PowerShell 5. It's a security must. Right? And several of them have told me, well, we don't allow it. We've uninstalled it. Now, is that possible?
It's technically possible. Windows is just a bunch of DLLs on the disk. So
you'd break it.
Yeah. I think, examples of things that stop working is like the Windows diagnostics. A lot of them are written in PowerShell. They'll stop working. any manageability you do. People in general are sick of writing all of the crappy command line parsers that you have to do to make just a regular tool. And the amount of flexibility that you give somebody with the PowerShell pipeline and having the PowerShell engine do all of the command line parsing for you, it figures out how to do shortening of parameter names and switches and all that kind of stuff. People are frankly sick of doing it the old way, and so if you remove it, you're losing access to thousands and thousands of commands that are built into Windows to help make your life better.
Right.
Yeah, with a 20, 30 line shell script before, now you can do it in 3 commands in PowerShell or whatever. I wish I would have had it more when I was a sysadmin. It would have made my life so much easier.
Well, the funny thing was, so before the PowerShell team, like when I was going through university, I hosted basically like a mini ISP for myself on a FreeBSD box. And so, I didn't give myself dial-up or anything, but, I hosted Apache.
Nice.
I had a bunch of Perl scripts and CGI scripts, hosted my own domain, DNS and bind and just all that stuff. And so that kind of represents the background that a bunch of us had in the PowerShell team coming into PowerShell. Some of the other people had spent some time, like a lot of time, working on the MKS toolkit for Windows, which was essentially porting Linux to Windows. And so there was this deep cultural understanding of the beauty of a good shell script and the beauty of making a complicated thing easy by bringing things together. And then after spending years on the PowerShell team and just getting used to, just even to this day, I'll write a command in PowerShell and just be shocked about how expressive and easy it was. And I started to worry that I was like losing my cred of like, I've been spoiled with this saccharine beauty that is PowerShell. And so I spent some time doing a lot of work back on a Mac, using that built-in version of Bash and all those tools, and just feeling like I couldn't believe that what I used to love of a complicated like awk or sed or grep or something, at this point you start to realize that I just didn't know that there could have been a better thing.
It's very clunky in comparison.
Once you get used to it, yeah. I still do it because I still love to see some of that stuff come out, but I really have been spoiled since.
What's the coolest thing that you've seen written in PowerShell by someone else that you were like, wow, that's amazing?
Oh, man.
How did they ever figure that out?
There's a bunch of stuff that people have done. One example that I thought was that just continually amazes me is there's people out there who are, every single learning step that they do, they're blogging about it and tweeting about it. And it's just wonderful because what you're seeing is as they put out their learning experiments, they're helping people around the world learn at that exact same stage. And then you'll see people who it's just like, they just put up a blog post for whatever reason, and they happened to use PowerShell. You've never heard of them before. And like, one I saw a couple weeks ago was somebody re-implementing Lisp, like the old Lisp. Don't want to call it a programming language, but Lisp. Because Lisp programmers will get frustrated if you call it a programming language. But so they re-implemented Lisp from scratch, so all the parsing, all of the basics and stuff, but they had done it in PowerShell, just like, I wanted to learn PowerShell. So they wrote the whole parser, the tokenizer, and it's just really nice PowerShell to read, and that was really their pet PowerShell project. And I just thought it's fascinating.
Very cool.
But when it comes to like the magic every day when you'd be at a PowerShell conference or something and somebody's like, oh, guess what I just did? We used to have this big system and I just it was taking all this time, it was down, and just with a couple lines of PowerShell, I was able to get rid of a ransomware or something like that. Just all the time, people solving these little niche problems. You're never going to get pre-baked software that does it for them. But to see people start to grow into this realization that they can do these custom things on their own, all the time hearing stories about that, I just love it.
So, Leah, we talked about uninstalling PowerShell, but I've always heard that it's not really possible because there's still other ways to call PowerShell. There's a DLL, and there's a couple of other things. You can't truly remove it now, right? It's become too ingrained in Windows.
I think with enough Procmon knowledge, you can solve any problem. The cool thing about PowerShell is, from the beginning, it's been written as a management engine, is system management automation. So it's really the DLLs that sit behind PowerShell, and it can be hosted in a bunch of different forms. And so PowerShell.exe is one application that hosts the management engine. But also in Windows, you have the PowerShell ISE, the scripting environment. That's another user interface on top of PowerShell.
Mm-hmm.
Exchange was a perfect example. Exchange wrote a user interface that dealt very, very heavily with this management engine. Exchange Online does it in a very amazing way as well. So it's true that if you just delete or block access to PowerShell.exe, you haven't blocked PowerShell, because you can still access the management engine itself. And so if you're trying to disable access to PowerShell or remove it, you for sure have to get rid of the DLLs as well.
And I just don't see why you would want to. So you're going to go through all of this trouble to try and disable and remove PowerShell, and you're severely limiting yourself, because at that point you're definitely on a Windows environment. So you might as well use it if you have it, right? Rather than just doing WMI and third-party software and stuff.
And I can get where some people say, you know what, screw security by obscurity. I'm going to do it anyways. And maybe if everybody else is going to get popped out there with a generic PowerShell malware of the week going out, I'm going to be safe because I'm going to block access to PowerShell. And I can get that logic sometimes. The thing that worries me the most about that philosophy, though, is when you talk raw numbers, PowerShell, it gets pretty well talked up in the media, but when you talk raw numbers and talk to any antivirus vendor, the number of actual PowerShell threats that they see as compared to just something based on an exe, it's not even 1 in 1,000. The number of exe-born viruses are thousands of times more than anybody using PowerShell. And PowerShell's never the actual entry point to an attack. It's always somebody already got onto your system, usually as admin, and then they have quality of life desires like other people, and they don't want to be stuck there using batch files. So they'll use PowerShell. But when you take a look at any of these attack chains, they end up being something like a Word doc calling PowerShell to download an exe over. Right. Which then launches an HTA. They're just, at this point, they're just tricking. They're just saying, I can do it, and there's nothing you can do to stop me because I'm going to do 4 different things.
Right.
I think there's a lot more value to doing something like deploying AppLocker and Defender application control in at least an audit mode. But ideally an enforce mode that prevents you from running stuff that's not approved. That's where you really start to make impacts security-wise.
Almost all the attacks I see use some component of PowerShell in them, as you described, right? The Word doc calling PowerShell.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much every attack uses PowerShell in such a way, whether it's the dropper that comes in, that's a script. Maybe it's JavaScript that has a PowerShell command inside it that's obfuscated, or it's using PowerShell to obfuscate some other batch command or something like that by encrypting it or whatnot, or encoding it. Right. But that's what I see. So I know PowerShell is used quite often in, I don't know, maybe the more sophisticated attacks than just your average everyday
off-the-shelf kind of malware.
Yeah, like maybe a browser hack or advanced persistent adware, right? It was a term that I first came across 6 months ago or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and to be honest, I don't know why they do it. If you review the way that they use PowerShell, it's, if I had any pride as an attacker, I would be working at removing complexity. Complexity is the source of all bugs. And when you've got something that is a Word doc that calls CMD, that calls PowerShell, that calls HTA, like all of those chains, unless they're giving you like a benefit, then they're an active liability. And at this point, PowerShell, for one thing, just using it to download a file is just a waste of your time. There's so many tools in Windows that can download a file.
And yes, I've seen it quite often just to download a file.
Yeah, I literally don't understand why they would do it. I think it's to be like, oh yeah, our exploit kit uses PowerShell, but at this point, and now especially with all of the stuff that's happened since PowerShell version 5, it's not just like a minor liability, it's just a gaping liability in terms of security transparency with the visibility now that people have into the way that PowerShell is being used on a system.
So let's talk about that. Why is it now a liability? What has been done in PowerShell 5, and why we recommend it, or we almost mandate it in PowerShell 5 that kind of gives companies a better leg up on attacks using PowerShell?
One of the ways that I like to think about it is, I think we've all seen the way that MITRE has done a good job of laying out, here's all the options that people have when they get into a system, right? They've got PowerShell, HTA, JavaScript, JScript, basically whatever you want. They've got Python, they've got Node, they got just all these kinds of things. If they use PowerShell, so if you block PowerShell, they can get their job done however that they want. So if you block PowerShell, they're going to get their job done using Python or Node or just any of these other things that are still on the box. Especially when you know that there's somebody behind the keyboard. If it's like, oh, you lucked out because it was one, maldoc that only could do one thing, yeah, sure, maybe you get lucky there. But if it's somebody where it's something like Empire or something where there's somebody actively behind a keyboard that's going to explore your system afterwards, blocking PowerShell doesn't help at all. But with the stuff since PowerShell version 5 around security transparency and the stuff that Python is working to bring in right now what you can do is see that these like PowerShell and Python are actively calling the registered antivirus like Defender or whatever to determine if the code is still safe to run, and they're logging everything that they're being asked to do. And so if something happens on your system and you've done your logging correctly, then you're going to have so much insight into what the attackers are doing. And that's exactly what you don't want as an attacker. You want to be finding ways that make you as quiet and as secretive as possible.
Yeah, I liked how you covered the PowerShell transparency stuff in your talk too, because you call it the PowerShell slime trail.
Yeah.
And where'd it go? So if an attacker is going to use PowerShell, let's make them regret it, which I loved. I think you should have that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, maybe I should get it in a tat.
Yeah. My next one is going to be live, laugh, log.
People are going to judge you for the first 2/3 of that. And then
I know. I'm going to get it in a nice, white girl script too.
Yeah.
And then what was I going to say? So kind of going back to, logging all of that in the new transparency stuff. You mentioned MITRE. Is there any other good resources you think for PowerShell defensive stuff? So I know there's the Violent Python book, but there's not really, other than MITRE, I don't know if there's a really good PowerShell security reference.
As in, like, what things to be worried about from the PowerShell
from a
perspective?
Defensive side, yeah.
One of the things that we did when it came to putting together PowerShell version 5 is we did a really deep analysis on what were the standard techniques and tricks that people were using when they were writing malicious PowerShell. And there's enough stuff out there, so I think it makes sense as a defender at this point when PowerShell sees anything that it knows to be kind of state of the art there. So if it sees any of the words that are traditionally used with injecting shellcode, for example, it's got kind of this built-in naughty words list where if you're using some of these APIs or whatever, then it will also log it with the warning level.
Okay.
And so I think there's been a pretty good job of the baseline, turn on logging, especially consider the stuff about warnings. The one thing that hasn't been happening in PowerShell product itself is aggressive back and forth when it comes to, for example, when you've enabled script block logging, attackers, what they can do is find ways, once they get code execution, they can find ways to dig around in the process memory and either disable PowerShell logging or disable the integration with the anti-malware scan interface.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, they've got code execution. It's all being logged, but once they execute that payload, then it's no longer being logged, or maybe it's no longer going into Defender. So that's a place where I think defenders can let themselves be a bit creative and take a look at what are some of the logging bypasses or logging disablements stuff that will get logged, and what are some of the things that people are using to bypass AMSI, and start to use those as creative ways to augment the kind of logging that they're doing.
Yep. It just looks to me like I'm going to have to write more regex for command line. That's how the first one that I detected on for the execution bypass really was just a giant regex of looking through PowerShell commands.
Yeah. So what we do is we use logmd to parse through the PowerShell log, and it has a config that's you can set to say, okay, how many tick marks do you want to look for? What other characters do you want to look for? Okay, if it's more than 5 plus signs in a script block, then flag that, and it comes out in an interesting artifact report. So like if you have more than 75 of the number 1 in a particular script block, things like that, base 64 block size, maybe you allow a certain size, but then when it gets over that limit, flag that as suspicious, things like that. And then you can have suspicious artifacts like the word -enc. Or the word bypass, things like that. And it's really cool that the PowerShell log actually will deobfuscate those commands for you so that you can actually look for those things.
And then you find a customer that's really super PowerShell automation heavy, and then you can't alert on any of that because they're doing all of it.
Well, that's the thing, is you make them put in there a particular string like Bob made this. and that goes in your whitelist. So if you see any script block that says Bob made this, then you completely ignore that. And you force them, if you have any scripts, put that string in there and I'll whitelist that string.
One of the things that I think hasn't really caught up in the ecosystem is the idea of post-processing logs before they get into a SEM, in terms of, at least at the ingestion point, doing some analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one of the things that Daniel Bohannon and I really tried to work at optimizing when we released the revoke obfuscation work, where the idea being, imagine pointing it at something like a WEF collector, where it's this big, huge log. So one of the things that I think we haven't done a very good job of exploring in the security community and the industry is the idea of post-processing logs, where you might have something like your WEF collector, where it's collecting event logs from across your enterprise. And then you can start to run automation against that collected event logs, event log itself, before then forwarding it on to your ultimate SEM. Yeah. And so this is a thing that Daniel Bohannon and I really explored with the revoke obfuscation work, where the revoke obfuscation itself, it had some configuration properties that said, so revoke obfuscation is a work we tried to do after Daniel Bohannon, Debo had done such a good job of releasing the invoke obfuscation framework. I kind of gave him some ribbing because I was like, everything you're pointing out is legitimate. People are writing overly fragile signatures, but also the world really isn't ready for how effective you made this. And I think truthfully, people who are getting busted by obfuscated PowerShell would have gotten busted by not obfuscated PowerShell anyways. So right. I think you see the obfuscated stuff, you might, curse somebody's name, but realistically, I think they probably would have gotten through anyways usually. But with revoke obfuscation, it's very clear. It has a capability that when you're processing an event log and detecting whether it's obfuscated or not, it's very clear about letting you specify, if the script block is signed with code signing cert, you can whitelist away certain publishers or specific hashes or maybe specific regexes. So it's very flexible in the way of saying like, hey, this is the automation that I know you've got. We're going to make sure to never flag that. But once it starts changing its hash, we'll have to review it once again before updating the allow list.
Right.
There's a link in the show notes to yours and Daniel's paper that you submitted for Black Hat, looks like, 2017. And that's going to do it this week for part 1 of our interview with Lee Holmes. You can find Lee on Twitter at Lee_Holmes, and that's HOLMES. If you want to talk about anything having to do with PowerShell or Azure Stack or anything DevOpsy that he might be able to help you with in the cloud. The show's official Twitter handle is @BreakSec. You can find Miss Berlin on Twitter at InfoSystir, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher, you can find him at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow myself, Brian Brake, on Twitter at BRYANBRAKE. We have a Patreon, so thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon. They help out with hosting fees. Our AV, we use Zoom for recording our podcast, so thank you for helping us out with that. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can find a link in our show notes or on our website at breakingsecurity.com, BRAKEING security.com. And we have a TPub store, so if you go to, you can get a t-shirt in the show notes. You can find links to all of our sites where you can download the podcast, whether it be iTunes, Google Play Store, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, or use an RSS reader for any of your favorite podcast apps. breakingsecurity.com /RSS for that. That was it for this week. Have a great week. Be kind to one another. Take care of yourselves, because only you have. And we'll talk to you again soon.